So we're going to kick off the debate with the very first speaker in favour and for the motion, and perhaps he will make his way to the podium while I introduce him. Our first speaker is the founder and chairman of Forward Thinking, an NGO which works with the leadership of all parties on both sides of the divide in the Israel-Palestine conflict, also a published author, regular broadcaster. Please welcome to speak first and for the motion, William Sieghart.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Your water's arrived, thank God. And I'd like to just echo what Jonathan has said about the makeup of the panel tonight. I'm a great admirer of Jeremy Ben-Ami and all that he's done with J Street in the United States and of Roger Cohen and his wonderful columns in their attempts to try and influence US government policy. On most areas in this debate, we're on the same side, but tonight we're parted because I think we have very different views, as you'll discover tonight. Mustafa and I have a big challenge this evening because I believe that, on the surface at least, supporting this motion seems to be rather counterintuitive. After all, for the last 40 years or so, US government officials and politicians have been crisscrossing the globe and at least appearing to be trying to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And they've had some notable successes. They've helped Israel make peace with Egypt and Jordan, and made various attempts to help Israel to do the same with the Palestinians. So why, you may ask, would it make any sense at all for Uncle Sam to butt out now? Well, I'm here tonight to argue that while the United States is in charge of trying to broker such a peace, in practice, it stops any serious progress in the conflict's resolution. Counterintuitive this may seem, but over the next few minutes, I hope you'll see what I'm getting at. Now, up until last February, to the cursory observer at least, the peace process looked to be reassuringly real. We would regularly see an Israeli prime minister sitting with a Palestinian or an Egyptian president, a Jordanian king, and the president of the United States in Washington or somewhere in the US, supposedly trying to make peace. But what no one would have told us was that the last thing President Mubarak or King Abdullah really wanted was a democratic Palestinian state based on one member, one vote, and the rule of law. Why? Because a successful democratic Palestinian state in their region would pull the rug from underneath these non-democratic rulers. After all, if the Palestinians could have pure democracy, why couldn't the Egyptians or the Jordanians? And the United States didn't want to weaken its key strategic allies by letting the democracy bug catch on. So the unfolding events of the Arab Spring have torn away the pretense and exposed the emptiness of what has been really going on for many, many years. No Egyptian president or Jordanian king will be heading to Washington with Mr. Netanyahu anymore. These regimes' interests were committed to the status quo. There were plenty of empty phrases mouthed about peace, but no real incentive for any progress. And from the United States' strategic perspective, the status quo in the Arab world supported its perceived military and economic interests as well. Cheap oil flowed. Regimes were eagerly supported and never questioned about their legitimacy or their human rights records, even if they were ruled by ruthless and corrupt autocrats, as we've seen over the last year or so. These were, after all, our guys. And all of this continued until last February, in the name of stability for the region. So the motivation for progress in solving the Israel-Palestinian conflict, from the United States' perspective, was outweighed by other considerations. But just as there was no genuine political commitment to progress in the peace process, underneath the surface, there were, and still are, plenty of influences in the United States that actually militate against any progress as well. Most politicians will tell you that the biggest obstacle to peace in this conflict is the continuing building of Israeli settlements. In some cases, these are towns or even cities that are constructed on Palestinian land in the West Bank, land that would have to be returned to the Palestinians in any peace deal. Indeed, Criticism of building of them has been official United States government policy for not just President Obama, but for a number of previous administrations before him. President Obama himself, you may recall, has spent the first 3 years of his presidency trying to get a settlement freeze. Why? Because over the last 25 years or so of the peace process, through the terms of 4 United States presidents, over 500,000 Israelis have settled in the West Bank. And amazingly, this has happened with the help of billions of dollars of aid from the United States, with many hundreds of millions of this money coming in the form of tax breaks to US citizens who donate money to Israel. So while the official government policy has been against this settlement building, the US tax system has encouraged its citizens to support them. Now, as if this were not troublesome enough, the United States policy on the Palestinians has also been completely counterproductive. Some Arabs will tell you that the Arab Spring began not last February, but in January 2006, when the Palestinians held their own free and fair election. An election which was won by the Change and Reform Party, a part of the Muslim Brotherhood, with 44% of the vote. Sounds familiar? The winners of this election, aka Hamas, declared a unilateral ceasefire and offered to extend this for a decade in order to begin serious negotiations towards a just and durable peace. Despite this being a golden opportunity to bring Hamas into the peace process, the United States, for fear of destabilizing its allies like President Mubarak and King Abdullah, decided not to recognize this result, and instead, with the help of Egypt and Jordan, armed the losers in the election, Fatah, who had been ousted by their people for perceived corruption and inefficiency, and sponsored a brutal civil war between the two groups. This division between the Palestinians still exists today. Now, it doesn't take a brain surgeon to work out that one of the key prerequisites or cornerstones to progress in resolving the conflict is unity amongst the Palestinians. Various countries like Saudi Arabia and Turkey have invested much time and energy in trying to achieve this. Yet the United States continues to veto the idea. Indeed, it's actually enshrined in US legislation passed by Congress against the pleas of Hillary Clinton and President Obama that if the two Palestinian factions, Fatah and Hamas, should unite and create a unified government with a unified negotiating position, the United States would have to cut off all financial support for the Palestinian Authority. Extraordinary? Yes, but true. And if you wanted any further evidence as to the United States' inability to resolve this conflict, even with a willing White House, let's look at the experience of President Barack Obama, a man whose first telephone calls on assuming the presidency were to the Israeli and Palestinian leaders, accompanied with a public declaration that this would be one of his top foreign policy priorities in his first term of office. Now, President Obama, as I said earlier, has been trying to persuade the Israeli government to freeze settlement building to allow negotiations to progress. Yet settlement building is currently happening at its fastest rate for many years. Less than 2 years ago, Obama made a speech at the United Nations declaring he could see the possibility of a Palestinian state being created within 12 months. A mere 12 months later from this speech, in another speech to the same assembled group of world leaders at the United Nations, Obama threatened to veto a proposal to the United Nations Security Council to recognize a Palestinian state. Even more humiliating for him, when a resolution was taken to the Security Council demanding a settlement freeze, the draft proposal used the very words that he had used in a speech of his own. So the proposal, representing official United States policy, as espoused by the US President himself, was vetoed on the instructions of the President himself. The United States was one lone voice amongst the 15 members of the Security Council. So startling was this that even the United Kingdom and France, two of the United States' closest allies, came out and condemned the veto. A sign that Europe has finally recognized what this motion tonight suggests, that the United States is incapable of following through on its own policy and therefore incapable of taking an even-handed approach in the conflict. So here is a president as committed to solving the conflict as any in living memory, and he finds himself unable, for various domestic political reasons, to gain any traction whatsoever. In fact, despite his inability to make progress and his obvious personal frustration with the Israeli Prime Minister, financial and military support for Israel from the United States has risen during his administration. Now, you may say Obama may not be in the White House next year. So let's look at the alternatives to President Obama, the leading Republican candidates for November's presidential elections. Mitt Romney, in his own words, doesn't believe the Palestinians want a two-state solution. He thinks they all want to destroy Israel. I don't believe there should be an inch of difference between us and our allies Israel, he says. Newt Gingrich goes a stage further by describing the Palestinians as a made-up people with no distinguishing national rights at all. And if you thought that's a worrying position, Rick Santorum's line is that all the people that live in the West Bank are Israelis. There are not Palestinians, there are no Palestinians, this is Israeli land. Now, I don't believe on that basis that any of these people could lead an even-handed approach to settling the conflict. But if you still have any doubts to the veracity of what I'm saying, just think of it this way. The US is the most powerful country in the world. As well as its uniquely dominant military and diplomatic power, it also gives enormous quantities of aid to both sides, to the Israelis and the Palestinians. Billions of dollars to one side, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to the other, every year. Yet despite this all-controlling power and influence, both hard and soft, on a country smaller than the size of Wales, in 45 years of United States control of the so-called peace process, it's been unable, with all its combined might, to bring about any fundamental change. In fact, the situation gets worse year after year. And as we sit here tonight, neither side are even talking to each other. Does it sound like Uncle Sam is helping, or does it sound like something else is going on? Who is to blame for this? Well, in a way, it's the complex system of government that is the United States. I'm not going to put the blame on specific individuals or the Jewish lobby, which works so effectively on Israel's behalf, or on Israel itself. I'm not going to blame the million or so Russian immigrants to Israel, who are predominantly right-wing in their views and have transformed the kibbutzim green in the miracle that Israel used to be. It's the aggregate of all of these interests that makes the system incapable of change. It's become an immovable force, regardless of the goodwill coming out of the White House. And as I think my example illustrates, in the United States, it doesn't matter who you are or where you are coming from, whether you're Barack Obama or Jack Bauer, you cannot shift the system. I believe, and this may be unlikely, but if the United States remove the unconditional diplomatic support that it provides to Israel in the United Nations, and threatened, in the light of straitened financial times in the world, to withdraw the massive financial aid to both the Israelis and the Palestinians, a genuine peace process would develop very quickly of its own accord. Reality and pragmatism would take over, with the drastic political changes in the region. In fact, tragically, it's probably only because Uncle Sam has a continued presence as the prospective arbiter and controller of the so-called peace process that the conflict carries on. So my conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, for the sake of the peace that the majority of Israelis and Palestinians and the rest of the world so desperately craves, butt out, Uncle Sam, butt out. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Stay there. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now you know why I wanted the glass of water up here, you see? Not just to drink. Thank you very much. Here's the twist on the format if you haven't been to an Intelligence Squared debate recently. We're going to use the next 2 or 3 minutes for those on the other side of the motion to have a chance to question the Speaker just on very specific points he's made. And why don't we start with you, Roger Cohen? Do you have a question for William Sieghart?
Yes, I do. William, if the United States is as committed to the status quo, to doing nothing as you make out, why do you think it has broadly encouraged the Arab Spring? Why was it part of the coalition to oust Gaddafi? Why did it restrain the Egyptian army and so make sure that Tahrir Square led to the ousting of Mubarak? Why has it called for the ousting of Assad? Why has it given support to Fayyad in the West Bank? Why has it, in the person of General Petraeus, said the continuation of this conflict is contrary to the U.S. strategic interest? Why?
There's an enormous difference between what politicians say and what politicians do. And I think, if I remember rightly, as we watched the defenestration of President Mubarak, that the United States administration was at least 72 hours behind the curve. In the United States at the time, if you remember, probably, privately, was desperate for Mubarak to survive. That meant stability for them. The United States is, I'm afraid, in the Arab Spring, not the encourager and supporter of the Arab Spring. It's always been a little behind the curve. That'd be the simple way of me answering your question.
All right. And Jeremy Ben-Ami, you also have a question, I think, for William Sieghart.
Well, just to defend the honor of my country, the solution that you put forward at the very end of your remarks seemed to be for the United States to take action, for the United States to withhold the veto, or for the U.S. to use aid as leverage. It would seem that butting out would not involve actually taking action, yet in search of a way to have leverage in order to move this forward, the place that you went was to U.S. action. So I'm just wondering whether that really is butting out or it's actually acting differently.
Well, butting out seems to me to stop interfering. And it's interfering financially and diplomatically in a way which is extremely unhelpful to resolving the conflict.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, William Sieghart.
Thank you.
Thank you.